The classroom smelled like pencil shavings and orange peels when Emma Castellan raised her hand and asked if she could read her assignment out loud to the class instead of turning it in. Her teacher, Mrs. Delgado, said yes, because Emma never raised her hand for anything. Emma was the kind of 8-year-old who ate lunch with a library book propped against her milk carton, who answered questions in a voice so quiet the front row had to lean in, who colored inside every line like the line itself might disappear if she didn't respect it. So when her hand went up, the whole room noticed. The assignment had been simple. Write a letter to someone you love. Most of the kids wrote to grandparents, to dogs, to older siblings who let them stay up late. Emma had written hers to a woman she had never met. She stood at the front of the room, holding a piece of wide-ruled paper with both hands like it might blow away. And she started reading. Dear Mom, I don't know what your voice sounds like. Dad says it was soft, like the sound the porch makes when it's raining, but not loud raining, just quiet raining. Mrs. Delgado's smile was still arranged on her face when the third sentence landed, and that's when it stopped being arranged and started being something else. She asked Emma if she could finish reading it herself, later, and Emma nodded and sat down without a word of protest, and Mrs. Bree Delgado spent the rest of the day carrying that piece of paper around in her bag like it was something that might spill. If you've ever had a kid in your life who was carrying something too heavy for their age and you didn't find out until it was almost too late, you know exactly the feeling that was sitting in that classroom. Stay with this one until the end, because what happened after that letter went home is not the story you're expecting. 10 years before that classroom, in a garage that smelled like cut wood and machine oil instead of orange peels, a man named Daniel Castellan was running his hand along the edge of a cabinet door, checking for a seam that wasn't supposed to be there. He found it. Of course he found it. Daniel found seams the way other people found typos in a text message, automatically and with a kind of quiet irritation that he never let show on his face. He sanded it down, blew the dust off with his own breath instead of reaching for the compressor, and set the door aside to dry. Stat. Daniel built furniture for a living, mostly kitchens and built-in shelving for people with more money than patience, and he did it alone in a converted garage behind a small rented house on the edge of town. He had done it alone for 8 years, ever since Emma was born and her mother was not there to help raise her. He didn't talk about that much. Not because it was a secret, but because talking about it didn't change anything. And Daniel was a man who preferred to spend his energy on things that could be changed. A crooked shelf could be fixed, a dead wife could not. Emma's mother, Rachel, had died 11 days after Emma was born. A complication nobody had flagged in time, the kind of quiet catastrophe that hospitals write up in careful language and families never stop replaying in their heads. Daniel had been left holding a newborn and a stack of paperwork, and no idea, none at all, how a person was supposed to do both of those things at once. He had figured it out anyway. He always figured things out. That was who he was. What he hadn't figured out in 8 years of figuring things out was how to talk to Emma about her mother in a way that didn't feel like handing her a wound and asking her to carry it. So mostly he didn't. He answered her questions when she asked them, plainly and honestly, but he never volunteered more than what was asked. He kept a single photograph of Rachel on the shelf above the fireplace, and he let Emma keep a scarf that used to belong to her mother folded in the drawer beside her bed. But beyond that, Rachel's presence in the house was more like a temperature than a topic. Felt everywhere, discussed nowhere. He thought that was enough. He thought silence, if it was gentle enough, could stand in for an answer. He was wrong, and it took a letter written in pencil on wide-ruled paper to show him exactly how wrong. Mrs. Delgado called him at 6:15 that evening, right as he was pulling a tray of chicken out of the oven, and her voice had the careful, measured tone of someone who had rehearsed what she was about to say at least twice in the car. She told him Emma had written something in class. She told him it was beautiful. She told him she thought he should read it before Emma brought it home herself, because she didn't want him blindsided in front of his daughter. Daniel said thank you and asked her to read it to him over the phone. Mrs. Delgado hesitated, then did. Dear Mom, I don't know what your voice sounds like. Dad says It was soft, like the sound the porch makes when it's raining, but not loud raining, just quiet raining. I think about you when it rains now. I know that's probably weird. And I have your picture in the living room, but pictures don't really tell you what someone was like. They just tell you what someone looked like. And I already know what you looked like. I want to know what you were like. I don't ask Dad about you very much because his face gets a certain way when I do, like he's trying really hard to hold something still. I don't want to make him hold things still, so I don't ask. But I think about you every day, probably more than he knows, and I wanted to tell somebody, so I'm telling you, even though I know you can't read this. Sometimes at school, when it's a day for moms, like the mom breakfast in November, I tell people, "You're working." I don't like lying, but I don't know what else to say that doesn't make everyone feel bad and look at me funny. I'm tired of being looked at funny. I don't know if you would have liked the same things I like. I don't know if you would have been proud of my drawings, the ones Dad puts on the fridge. I don't know if you would have braided my hair different than the way I do it now, which is not very good. I just do a regular braid because nobody taught me a fancy one. I love you, even though I never met you. I don't know if that's allowed, loving someone you never met, but I do it anyway. I hope, wherever you are, you know that Dad takes care of me really well. He's a good dad. I just wish I didn't have to be the one who decides not to make him sad by asking about you. I wish someone else could decide that for me sometimes. Love, Emma. Mrs. Blanks. Delgado stopped there because that was where the letter ended, and there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for her to ask if he was still there. Daniel said he was. His voice did not shake. He thanked her again, said he'd talk to Emma that night, and hung up the phone with the kind of careful, deliberate motion of a man setting down something he was afraid he might otherwise drop. He stood in the kitchen for a while after that, not moving, the chicken cooling on the counter. And he thought about every time in the last 8 years he had watched Emma's face go quiet at the mention of a mother. Every time he had let that quiet stand because he didn't know what to fill it with. Every time he had told himself that not bringing up the pain was the same thing as protecting her from it. He realized, standing there, that those were not the same thing at all. He had built her a house with a room in it that nobody was allowed to enter and called that safety. When Emma got home from her after-school program at 5:45, Daniel didn't say anything about the phone call. He let her wash up, let her tell him about the math worksheet and the argument 2 boys had over a soccer ball at recess, let dinner happen the way dinner always happened, with the 2 of them at a small round table that Daniel had built himself out of reclaimed oak. It was only after dinner, after the dishes were rinsed and stacked, that he sat down across from her on the living room couch and asked her gently if she wanted to tell him about the letter she wrote in school. Emma's whole body went still the way it did when she thought she was in trouble, and Daniel saw that stillness and understood, maybe for the first time with total clarity, exactly how much his daughter had learned to manage him. Not out of fear, out of love. She had been protecting him from her own grief for years, quietly, the same way he had been protecting her from his. He told her Mrs. Delgado had read it to him. He told her it wasn't in trouble, that nothing about it was wrong, that it was one of the most honest things he'd ever heard. He watched her shoulders come down half an inch, the way a held breath finally leaves a body. Then he told her he was sorry. Emma asked him what he was sorry for. Daniel said he was sorry that she'd felt like she had to carry all of that by herself. He said he thought that by not bringing up her mother very much, he was making things easier for her. But that he saw now, he might have just made her feel like the subject was forbidden, like grief was something you handled alone in a room with the door shut. Emma didn't say anything for a moment. Then she asked quietly if they could talk about her mom sometimes. Not all the time, just sometimes. Daniel said yes. He said they could talk about her whenever Emma wanted, for as long as she wanted, and that he would try to stop being a man whose face closed up like a fist every time her name came up. He kept that promise the way he kept every promise, which is to say completely and without fanfare. Over the following weeks, something in the house shifted. Quietly, the way a room feels different after furniture has been rearranged, even if you can't immediately say what moved. Daniel started telling Emma small things about Rachel, unprompted at breakfast in the car, while sanding a table together in the garage. He told her Rachel used to sing off-key on purpose to make him laugh. He told her Rachel hated the color yellow, but loved yellow flowers, which never made sense to either of them. He told her the porch rain comparison Emma had made in her letter was almost exactly right, that Rachel's voice really had been like that, soft and steady, like something you could lean your whole weight against. Emma asked more questions after that, not many at once. A few here and there, dropped into ordinary moments the way you'd test the temperature of water with one finger before stepping in. Word of the letter did not stay contained to one classroom, because that is not how small, true, aching things work. Mrs. Edgy Delgado mentioned it to the school counselor, partly out of concern and partly because she couldn't stop thinking about it. The counselor asked if she could share it, anonymized, with a regional teachers network she was part of, a private group where educators traded resources and occasionally, quietly, traded the things that broke their hearts a little. Someone in that group posted an excerpt of the letter, with Emma's name removed and Mrs. Delgado's permission secured, on a public page meant for teachers to share moments from the classroom. It was meant for maybe 200 people. It did not stay with 200 people. Within 4 days, the excerpt had been shared more than 60,000 times. People who had lost parents young commented that they'd never had the words for what Emma had written, but had felt every sentence of it since childhood. People who had raised children without a partner talked about the impossible math of trying to be enough for 2 parents while grieving the loss of being one yourself. A woman in another country wrote that she'd read it to her husband, and they had both cried on their kitchen floor. A local news producer found the post on a slow Thursday and thought it might make a nice, gentle segment. The kind that runs at the end of the broadcast to send people to bed feeling something soft. She tracked down the school through a mutual contact, confirmed the story with Mrs. Delgado, and asked, carefully and with real sensitivity, whether the family might be willing to talk. Daniel's first instinct was no. He had spent 8 years keeping his daughter's grief private, and the idea of putting a camera in front of it felt like exactly the kind of exposure he'd sworn to protect her from. He asked Emma what she thought, because by then he had learned, in a way he hadn't fully understood before, that Emma was not a small object to be managed, but a whole person with opinions about her own story. Emma thought about it for 2 days. Then she said she wanted to do it, but only if she got to say the things she actually wanted to say, not just read the letter again and cry on television for people to feel sorry for her. Daniel asked her what that thing was. Emma said she wanted to tell other kids like her that it was okay to ask questions, that the asking wasn't the thing that hurt people. The silence was. Daniel looked at his daughter for a long moment, and something in his chest, some old, careful architecture built entirely around protecting her from pain, quietly rearranged itself into something new. He told her that was a very good reason, and that he would do it with her on one condition, that if at any point during filming she wanted to stop, they would stop, no explanation required. Emma agreed. The segment aired on a Friday evening, 6 minutes long, gentle and unhurried, mostly just Daniel and Emma sitting together on that same living room couch, Emma reading a shortened version of her letter, and then looking directly into the camera to say the things she'd wanted to say all along. She said, "Grief doesn't go away if you don't talk about it. It just goes quiet, and quiet things get heavier, not lighter." The response was not gentle in scale, even if the segment itself had been gentle in tone. Within a week, the clip had been picked up by 3 national outlets. A well-known daytime talk show reached out asking if Emma and Daniel would come on as guests. A publisher who specialized in children's grief resources asked whether Emma would be interested when she was older in helping shape a book for kids who'd lost a parent before they could remember them. Letters started arriving at the school, addressed simply to Emma, some from children, most from adults who had once been children carrying something similar. Daniel handled all of it, the way he handled everything, methodically, without letting the noise dictate the pace. He declined the talk show, gently, saying Emma was 8 and this was already a lot for an 8-year-old to carry, camera or no camera. He said yes to nothing, that asked Emma to perform her grief on command, and yes to a few things that seemed to genuinely serve other families, quietly carrying the same weight. One of those was a phone call from a woman named Vivian Ashworth. Vivian ran a small, well-regarded foundation that funded grief counseling programs in public schools, mostly through grants and partnerships that most parents never even knew existed until their child needed one. She had seen the segment 3 times before she called the school, and something about Daniel's calm in front of the camera, his complete lack of performance, had stayed with her longer than the segment itself. She wasn't calling about Emma. Not really. She was calling about Daniel. Vivian's foundation was in the middle of an uncomfortable internal reckoning. An internal audit, quiet and not yet public, had revealed that the regional director overseeing school partnerships, a man named Preston Halloway, had been steering a significant portion of program funding toward vendors that, on paper, provided training materials and counselor certification courses, but that on closer inspection seemed to exist mostly to generate invoices. Preston sat on the boards of 2 of those vendors. Nobody on the foundation's own board had noticed, because Preston had built a reputation as the foundation's most persuasive fundraiser, its most polished public face. The man who always had a compelling story ready for donors and a spreadsheet ready for the auditors, right up until someone finally looked closely enough at the spreadsheet. Vivian, who had inherited leadership of the foundation from her late father 5 years earlier, and had spent most of those 5 years insulated from its day-to-day operations by people like Preston, who assured her everything was running smoothly, was not naive. But she had been trusting in the specific way people are trusting when they've never had a reason not to be. She called Daniel, not to offer him a job, not yet, but because she wanted to understand something. She wanted to know how a man raising a daughter alone, running a small furniture business, working with his hands every day, had managed to raise a child capable of writing something so unflinchingly honest when Vivian's own foundation, built on the premise of helping grieving families speak the unspeakable, couldn't even get its own executives to be honest about an invoice. Daniel didn't have a polished answer for her. He said only that he'd learned, recently and the hard way, that pretending a hard thing isn't there doesn't make it lighter for the person carrying it, it just makes them carry it alone. Vivian sat with that answer longer than she expected to. 2 weeks later, she asked if she could visit his workshop. Daniel found this an unusual request from the head of a grief foundation, but he said yes, mostly because Emma, upon hearing about it, said she wanted to meet the Porch Rain Lady, a nickname she'd assigned Vivian after watching a clip of her speaking warmly about grief programs in an interview. Vivian arrived on a Saturday afternoon in a car too clean for the gravel road leading to Daniel's converted garage, and she stood for a while in the doorway, just watching him work before either of them said anything. He was running a plane along the edge of a long walnut board, slow even strokes, checking the surface with the flat of his hand every few passes rather than his eyes. The garage smelled like sawdust and neatsfoot oil. Tools hung on a pegboard in an order that clearly meant something specific to the person who'd arranged them, and clearly meant nothing to anyone else. Vivian said it was quiet out there. Daniel said that was the point. Sell. She asked him how long he'd been doing this kind of work. He said, since Emma was born. He'd worked in structural engineering before that, inspecting building frameworks for a mid-sized firm, but the hours hadn't left him enough time to be the kind of father he needed to be once he was the only parent left. So he built something smaller, slower, something he could do from home with a baby monitor clipped to his belt. Vivian asked if he missed it. The engineering, Daniel said sometimes. He said there was a particular kind of satisfaction in finding the one flaw in a structure that everybody else had walked past 100 times. He said furniture gave him a smaller version of that same feeling, a seam that didn't sit right, a joint that would fail in 10 years if he didn't fix it now, and he liked that his work still had that shape to it, even at this scale. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she told him plainly what she hadn't planned to tell him quite so soon, that her foundation had a rot in it somewhere near the top, that she suspected it went deeper than one man's dishonest invoices, and that she needed someone who could look at a structure, whether it was made of wood or paperwork, and find the flaw everyone else had learned to walk past. Daniel set down his plane and looked at her for a long moment. He said he built furniture, not audits. Vivian said she wasn't asking him to be an auditor. She was asking him to be exactly what he already was, a person who noticed what other people had trained themselves not to. Daniel didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the house, where Emma was visible through the kitchen window, sitting at the table with a coloring book, humming something to herself that might have been a song from school, or might have been something entirely her own. He told Vivian he'd think about it, and that whatever he decided, it would have to work around Emma's school schedule, her evenings, her life. Nothing was going to come before that. Vivian said that was, in fact, exactly the kind of answer that had convinced her to make the offer in the first place. Daniel started 2 weeks later, in a limited part-time capacity, reviewing program partnership records for the Foundation's school grief counseling initiatives. It wasn't a full audit, not officially. Vivian had framed it internally as a program quality review, something vague enough not to alarm Preston Halloway, who was, after all, still the regional director overseeing exactly the programs Daniel had been asked to look at. Daniel worked the way he always worked, methodically, quietly. He read every contract twice. He cross-referenced every vendor invoice against the actual training materials delivered to actual schools. And when the materials didn't match the invoices or didn't exist at all, he wrote it down plainly, without embellishment, the way he'd note a hairline crack in a support beam. Preston noticed him almost immediately and did not like what he noticed. Preston Halloway was a tall man with a talent for filling a room with his voice before he'd said anything worth hearing. He wore his confidence like a well-tailored suit, and, in fairness, it mostly was one. He had built his career at the Foundation on being the person everyone believed without checking the fundraiser, whose numbers always looked good enough that nobody asked to see the underlying math. He found Daniel in the small shared office Vivian had set up for him on the Foundation's second floor, a converted supply closet with a desk crammed in sideways, and he leaned against the doorframe with the easy condescension of a man who had never once in his adult life doubted his own footing. He asked Daniel if he was finding everything he needed. Daniel said he was. Preston said he should mention, just as a professional courtesy, that these vendor relationships went back years, long before Vivian's father had passed, and that a lot of institutional trust had been built up around them. He said sometimes, when you're new to an organization, things look strange on paper that make perfect sense once you understand the history. Daniel said he understood that some things had a history behind them. He said he was more interested in whether the training materials the schools were paying for actually existed. Preston's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes did, briefly, like a shadow crossing a window. He said the materials were proprietary, developed in partnership with the vendors, and not always something that got filed in the same folder as everything else. He said Daniel was welcome to request them formally through the proper channel, though that process could take a few weeks. Daniel said he would submit the request that afternoon. Preston left without saying anything further. Daniel noted in the small logbook he kept for himself out of long habit the exact date and time of that conversation. The formal request for training materials submitted that afternoon took not a few weeks but 11 days to receive any response at all. And when the response came, it was not the materials themselves but a memo from Preston's office stating that the vendor in question, a company called BrightPath Learning Solutions, had recently undergone a systems migration that had resulted in the loss of several years of archived training documentation. Daniel read the memo twice. Then he called Vivian. He told her, in the plain, unembellished language he used for everything, that a company being paid $400,000 a year to provide grief counselor certification materials to schools across the region had apparently lost every copy of those materials in a filing system accident, and that he found this both statistically unlikely and professionally convenient. Vivian asked what he thought it meant. Daniel said he thought BrightPath Learning Solutions probably didn't produce much of anything at all, and that the $400,000 a year was likely going somewhere other than school counselors. Vivian was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she asked him to keep going. Quietly, without telling Preston how far he'd gotten. Daniel kept going. Over the following weeks, working evenings after Emma was asleep and weekends when she was at a friend's house, Daniel built a picture the way he built furniture, one careful joint at a time. He requested public business registration records for BrightPath Learning Solutions, and found that it had been incorporated 6 years earlier by a registered agent whose address matched a mailbox rental store 2 towns over. He requested the same for 2 smaller vendors also receiving foundation money for curriculum development, and found the same registered agent, the same mailbox address filed within 4 days of each other. He found that Preston Holloway's name did not appear anywhere on the official incorporation paperwork for any of the 3 companies. He found, instead, that Preston's wife's maiden name did. He found that the invoices submitted by all 3 companies, when laid side by side, used nearly identical line-item language, the kind of phrasing that comes from one person writing 3 different letterheads rather than 3 different organizations, actually doing distinct work. He found that the total amount funneled through these 3 vendors over 5 years came to just under $2 million, almost 11% of the Foundation's entire annual grant-making budget, money that had been raised in the name of grieving children and quietly rerouted into a small, private network Preston Holloway had built and hidden inside the Foundation's own books. Daniel did not confront Preston with any of this. He was not interested in confrontation for its own sake. He wrote it all down carefully, in a report structured the same way he would document a structural failure in a building, with dates, sources, and plain, unembroidered conclusions, and he gave the report to Vivian on a Tuesday evening in her office after the rest of the staff had gone home. Vivian read it once quickly, the way you read something when you're afraid of what it says. Then she read it again slowly, the way you read something when you need to understand exactly how bad it is. She asked Daniel if he was certain. Daniel said the paperwork was certain. He said he was only the person who had read it carefully enough to notice. Vivian sat with the report open on her desk for a long moment, and Daniel watched something settle over her face, the particular stillness of a person realizing that trust they'd inherited along with the title had been quietly spent by someone else without their knowledge. She said she wanted this handled in front of the full board, publicly, not swept into a quiet resignation with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement, which she suspected was exactly what Preston would push for the moment he sensed the walls closing in. Daniel said that was her decision to make, but that the paperwork would say the same thing, regardless of who was in the room when it was read. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday morning, framed to the wider staff simply as a quarterly program review. The same bland language Vivian had used to describe Daniel's original assignment. Preston, as regional director, was expected to present an update on school partnership programs, which meant he would be standing at the front of the room, by his own request, discussing the exact vendors Daniel had spent 6 weeks quietly dismantling on paper. Daniel did not attend the meeting expecting to be the center of it. He assumed, reasonably, that Vivian would present the findings herself, and that his part in it would end with the report he'd already handed over. Vivian had other plans, though she didn't tell him that until the morning of. She called him at 8, told him she needed him at the meeting at 10, and said only that she thought the board would take the findings more seriously, coming from the person who had actually done the work rather than secondhand through her. Daniel, who did not enjoy rooms full of people any more than his daughter did, said he would be there anyway, because the truth of the report didn't change based on his personal comfort, and comfort had never been a good enough reason to let something wrong stay hidden. The boardroom on the 10th floor had a long glass table and a wall of windows overlooking the river, and by 10 o'clock it was full. 9 board members, 2 staff attorneys, Vivian at the head of the table, and Preston Holloway standing near a projector screen with the easy, expansive posture of a man who had given this exact kind of presentation 100 times before and expected this one to go exactly the same way. He began talking before Vivian had fully called the meeting to order, walking the board through a slide showing year-over-year growth in school partnerships, expanding grief counseling access, rising satisfaction scores from participating districts. He used the word impact 4 times in the first 2 minutes. He mentioned BrightPath Learning Solutions as a valued curriculum partner whose materials had helped train counselors in over 60 schools. He was 3 slides into a presentation that would have, under any other circumstances, earned polite applause when Vivian said his name and asked him to pause. Preston paused, smiling, the smile of a man who assumed he was about to be complimented. Vivian said there had been a program quality review conducted over the past 6 weeks, and that she wanted to share its findings with the board before Preston continued. She looked toward the back of the room where Daniel was sitting quietly, in a chair near the door, a folder closed on his lap, and she asked him to come forward. Preston's smile did not immediately falter. He said with a light, easy laugh, directed at the board rather than at Daniel, that he wasn't aware they'd brought in outside consultants and that he'd have appreciated being looped in earlier purely for coordination's sake. Vivian said the review had been conducted at her direct request and that coordination hadn't been the priority. Accuracy had been. Daniel walked to the front of the room, opened his folder, and did not raise his voice once during the next 11 minutes. He laid out the incorporation records for BrightPath Learning Solutions and the 2 smaller vendors sliding printed copies down the table so board members could see them directly rather than take his word for it. He showed the shared, registered agent address. He showed the maiden name on the incorporation documents, and then, without editorializing, without a single unnecessary word, he said that name matched public marriage records for Preston Holloway's wife. He showed the identical invoice language across all 3 supposedly separate companies. He showed the total sum diverted over 5 years, just under $2 million, and he said plainly that this was money raised specifically for grief counseling programs in schools, money that had instead been funneled through shell companies, effectively controlled by the man currently standing at the front of the room describing the foundation's impact. He said the training materials Preston had just referenced as helping counselors in 60 schools did not appear to exist. He said he had requested them formally 11 days prior and had been told they were lost in a systems migration. He said he found no record of any systems migration occurring at BrightPath Learning Solutions during the relevant period, because BrightPath Learning Solutions had no employees, no office, and no operations beyond a mailbox and a bank account. Then Daniel closed his folder and sat back down, because he had said everything the paperwork required him to say, and he did not believe in saying more than that. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Preston tried, briefly, to recover. He said the timing of these documents was suspicious, that anyone could construct a misleading narrative by cherry-picking dates, that he'd like the opportunity to review this so-called report with his own counsel before anyone drew conclusions. He said the word witch hunt once, and immediately seemed to regret the word the moment it left his mouth, because 2 board members exchanged a look that made clear they had already drawn their conclusions. One of the board members, an older woman named Constance Whitfield, who had served on the Foundation's board since its founding and who had known Vivian's father personally, asked a single question that ended the meeting for all practical purposes. She asked Preston to explain simply why his wife's maiden name was on the incorporation paperwork for a company that had received $400,000 a year from the foundation, if he had no relationship to that company whatsoever. Preston did not have an answer that survived contact with the question. He said something about administrative convenience, about his wife helping a friend set up the paperwork years ago, about not being involved in the day-to-day operations, and every sentence sounded smaller and less convincing than the one before it. The way a house of cards doesn't collapse all at once, but rather leans, then leans further, then simply isn't standing anymore. Vivian did not raise her voice either. She said the board would need to meet privately to determine next steps, and that Preston was suspended from his duties, effective immediately, pending a full independent audit. An audit that would now, given what had already surfaced, extend well beyond the 3 vendors Daniel had reviewed. Preston was escorted from the building that same afternoon by the Foundation's general counsel, and by the following Monday, the board had voted unanimously to terminate his employment and refer the matter to outside legal authorities for further review. The reckoning, once it started moving, moved quickly. The way water finally breaks through a dam, it's been quietly eroding for years. Daniel did not attend any of the meetings that followed. His part, as far as he understood it, had ended the moment the report was on the table and read. Vivian came to see him at the workshop again, about 2 weeks after the board meeting, on another Saturday afternoon. She found him sanding the same long walnut board, further along now, the wood taking on the smooth, warm look of something nearly finished. She told him the audit had expanded and had found even more than the 3 vendors Daniel had flagged. She told him The board was restructuring the entire grant oversight process, adding independent review requirements that hadn't existed before, in no small part because of what Daniel's quiet, methodical work had exposed. She told him donor confidence, which she'd feared would collapse once the story became public, had instead held steady and in some cases grown, because people trusted an organization more, not less, for catching its own rot and cutting it out in the open rather than quietly burying it. Then she told him the real reason she'd come. The board wanted to offer him a permanent position, not part-time, not a temporary review. A newly created role, reporting directly to the board, rather than to any single executive, with the explicit mandate of independently auditing program partnerships and vendor relationships across the entire foundation on an ongoing basis, answerable to no one who might have a personal incentive to make her looking away worth his while. Daniel set down the sandpaper and looked at her for a long moment. He said he appreciated it, but that he had a daughter who needed him home most evenings, and a business he'd built slowly over 8 years that he wasn't interested in abandoning. Vivian said she'd anticipated that answer and that the role could be structured however he needed. Part-time hours, remote work where possible, a schedule built entirely around Emma's life, not around the foundation's convenience. She said, and this part she said more carefully, that she also thought the role needed to exist independent of any single person's authority over it, including her own, because the entire reason Preston had gotten away with what he'd gotten away with for 5 years, and closely enough, for long enough, without someone above them deciding it wasn't worth the trouble. Daniel thought about it for a few days, the way he thought about everything, without rushing toward a decision just because someone else was waiting on it. He came back to Vivian with a counterproposal instead of a simple yes. He said he'd take the role, but that he wanted it structured as an independent auditor position with a fixed, limited number of hours per month, reporting in writing directly to the full board rather than to any single executive, including Vivian herself, so that no future leader of the foundation, however well-intentioned, could quietly narrow his access, the way Preston had clearly managed to narrow everyone else's for years. He said he wanted the position written into the foundation's bylaws, not just its org chart, so that it couldn't be quietly eliminated the next time someone found an inconvenient truth. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, and something that might have been the beginning of real respect settled into her expression, the kind of respect that isn't given easily and isn't taken back once it's earned. She said that was, in fact, exactly the kind of proposal she'd hoped he would make. The foundation adopted the new bylaw 8 weeks later, unanimously, and Daniel began work as its first independent program auditor, a role that existed deliberately outside the reach of any one person's ego or ambition. In Taz, he kept the furniture business, he kept the workshop, he kept his evenings free for Emma and his weekends mostly untouched, and the small, orderly rhythm of a life built around a child rather than a career. Months later, on an evening in early spring, Daniel sat on the back steps of the house with Emma, both of them eating popsicles that were melting faster than either of them could keep up with. The sky doing that long, slow fade from orange to blue that happens right before the streetlights come on. Emma asked him if he thought her mom would be proud of the letter. Daniel said he thought her mom would be proud of a lot of things, but that letter, especially because it had taken something Emma was carrying alone and turned it into something that helped other people carry theirs a little more easily. Emma asked if the foundation lady, the porch rain lady, was going to come over again soon. Daniel said probably, since Vivian had mentioned wanting to see how the walnut table was coming along, though he suspected the table wasn't really the reason. Emma said she knew that. She said it in the easy, matter-of-fact way that children sometimes say the truest things, without any sense that they've said anything remarkable at all. Daniel didn't answer that directly. He just handed her a napkin for the popsicle drips running down her wrist, and the two of them sat there a while longer, watching the sky finish its fade, in the kind of quiet that no longer had anything locked behind it.